How's it going? Happy Saturday. Wonderful to have all of you. Hi, Sparks. Hello, Sparks. There we go. This Saturday morning book club is dedicated to you. I actually really enjoyed this book. It's a lot of things that I already knew about, just because these sort of things get talked about within the games industry, and I was doing PR during a big chunk of when this book was focusing on certain games, such as Uncharted 4. I helped do PR and marketing for it. And Destiny 1, I was really interested in this game when it first was announced because it was made by the same people who did Halo. And then obviously this book is a little outdated just because technology in video games, the industry and news in it moves so quickly, because it's saying things like, how will people react to Destiny 2? What will happen to the series after that? Destiny 2 has already been out. And it seems as though people are universally praising all the changes that they've made to it in good ways. But this book is Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreider, Schrader? There we go, Schrader, we got it. Who is a well-known games journalist. It is a national bestseller, the triumphant, turbulent stories behind how video games are made. There are stories behind Diablo 3, Destiny, Witcher 3, Halo Wars, Uncharted 4, Shovel Knight, Star Wars 1313, 1313. I'm not exactly sure how that's pronounced, because it is a canceled project. Pillars of Eternity, Dragon Age Inquisition, and Stardew Valley. So there's a nice representation of very small indie games to mid-sized studios, and then finally to big AAAs, their sequels and new IPs and so on. So I think what we're going to talk about is the first few chapters, because I do want people to have a reason to keep going through. So if they're like really into Destiny, for instance, there's a really nice long chapter about that. If you're more focused on indie games, there's a few of those, such as The Witcher technically, and Shovel Knight and Stardew Valley, that are also spoken about. Halo Wars, Diablo 3 are things that I was really interested in and really enjoyed reading about as well too. But I think we can just get right into it. And I'll tell you some of the quotes and stories that I've grabbed out of it towards the beginning, and a general overarching conclusion that I have made from reading this book, and also just things that I know about the gaming industry. So one of the very first quotes, testimonials, reviews at the beginning of the book says, by Leah Alexander, who's an author and a tech journalist, quote, "So many of the cultural problems both within the games industry and among fans comes down to a lack of realistic public understanding of the tribulations of development." And I think that's something that is echoed through every single story that is spoken about within this game, within this book. You need to figure out exactly the amount of people that you can afford to hire and for how long. What kind of designers, programmers, producers, and everything in between to be able to properly create and publish a game. And one of the quotes that Jason got from a friend of his after their game launched was that it's a miracle that any game is made, which is really interesting because games have been being made by people, from big companies to out of your parents' garages since the 1970s. So how is it that in 2019 all the way up till now. So it's almost 2020. If games have been starting to be made since like the 1970s, that means that we have almost 50 years of experience in game development and creation. So why has it not grown more efficient? Why do people still crunch? Why do games get canceled? Why do games go over budget, over schedule, and so on? Because the video game industry is a $3 billion industry in the United States alone, according to the Entertainment Software Association in 2016. And this book by Jason, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, speaks about 10 different chapters that focus on 10 different games, or 10 different studios, and what they did in those time periods before one of the games that are spoken about in that chapter ships. And then a introduction and a epilogue. Every single video game in this book is made under abnormal circumstances, and that is not an anomaly. A big reason why games development hasn't really grown more efficient and is still very difficult is because it is a precarious blend between art and technology. And the technology keeps getting better and better. We are on the cutting edge of it. Every single day, more things evolve and get processed. And then, on the other hand, it is an art form as well, too. And artists, even if they're very technical or very theory-driven or practical-driven, they always want to make sure that the product that they put out is the best thing that they could have done at that time. And even then still, they push themselves even further because you have a lot of pride in your work. This is a creation that you've put so much of your blood, sweat, and pixels into, that you want the work that you've been doing since the very beginning to be worth it all the way up until the end. And so that's how crunch also starts. There are also 4 very important things about video games to keep in mind as well too that this book covers. Video games are an interactive medium. They need to remember your actions and store your data up. So when you speak to a certain person at a certain time before you talk to another character, that all needs to be remembered and saved properly. Also, that doesn't even include multiplayer games where within nanoseconds your inputs need to be there and need to be seen by someone halfway across the world. And that's a whole nother beast as well too. And if the interactivity that the player has to input isn't very clear, or there isn't an understanding of why the player's actions are important, players get disillusioned and break out of the immersion and don't want to play anymore. Hello, the exception. So technology is constantly changing. Computers are having more photorealistic graphics and processing that gets more and more powerful. And we're always pushing the boundaries to get better and better. Third, the tools that we use are always different and are constantly evolving as well too. Game development in general is not about having a great idea. It's about having the skill of taking a great idea and putting it from paper into a product. And that is something that plagues a lot of different industries. You can have a great idea on how to reinvent a company or have a better product or how to have a wonderful stream. But if you don't put the work into building that out and then also learning how to micro adjust your plan as things get obstacles or scheduling and time shifts occur, then you're never going to be able to produce even something as close to what you want. And I think our very first book club, Black Box Thinking, talks about this a lot too, where people need to be comfortable with failing or scrapping ideas, even if they've put a lot of effort into it, because it doesn't work with an overarching goal or plan or mission statement in mind. And that also brings us to this last point. Scheduling is impossible. It's unpredictable and challenging. And you don't know how fun a game is until you finally played it. But you can't play the game until you have an engine with physics and characters and environments to interact with that will be representative of the final shipment of the game. Hello, Little Miss F. Thank you for the host. An idea might be too raw or early for their time. That's very true as well too. That happens a lot. You can look at that in like the technological industry very easily with like the snap lenses or Google Glass. It's something that we are going to have eventually. But people just aren't into it yet, and it's also the tech isn't fully developed because it's not clear if you're recording someone, and also the glasses don't look as stylish as people want, and so on. So being able to balance all of that takes a while. So overall, there's several common themes of the stories in this book. Every game has been delayed at least once. Every game developer had to make tough compromises. Every studio had to sweat over which hardware and technology and software and tools to use. Every studio built schedules around development and feedback from their fans. And everyone who makes video games has to crunch and sacrifice their personal lives and their family time for a job that never seems to end until it finally ships. And then even after shipment, they have day one patches and DLCs to work on as well too. So Jason also states at the beginning of the book that most of the people who speak in this book are male, which is, according to him, a depressing and unintentional reflection of the industry for decades now, who has been dominated by men. The majority of this book talks about games from 2015 to 2017 that have released, and there are over 100 game developers and industry figures who have been interviewed for this book, and their thoughts have been computed by Jason and compiled into this book. So, oh yeah, Sparks, it's absolutely fantastic. TV shows are similar to that though. Sometimes books and movies can also be similar, but in the sense of sequels or additional compendiums added into the universes. But video games are incredibly unique because if the customer doesn't want to interact with it, they won't buy the product, or if they've bought the product and they're not interested in, they didn't get captivated and they don't want to put the work in to continue on, then they're not going to see the rest of the game. They're not going to become involved or invested in that game studio, in the game developers, in the publisher, and won't continue to look out for more releases by these people as well too. Sequels can change direction or some things, but not as much as video games. I absolutely agree, and that's why I love video games so much. Because the consumer is such a vital part comparatively to other entertainment media. That's true. Rainbow Six Siege got heavily overhauled over the years. So did Heroes of the Storm. I played it back in the original betas, and I did enjoy it to a point, but it was kind of just a little too difficult and not very fun to level up while you were doing a match, and I didn't touch it for a few years. And recently, the last 12 months, I got really back into it, partially because I wasn't really playing World of Warcraft very heavily, and I wanted to play with some Warcraft characters, but not play World of Warcraft, so I would be able to play these epic kings and queens within the Warcraft series, but in 10-minute, 20-minute matches, which really helped as well too, especially since they did the year 1 or year 2 update where they overhauled so much of how people level, how people get loot in the game as well too, like cosmetics and such. It's great. Thanks, little Miss F. I love it too. It's as big as my head, and it makes sure that I drink enough water. I've obviously drank a lot this morning. So the 2 chapters I'm going to speak about are the first 2, to give you a feeling on how these ideas that were stated earlier are so pervasive to so many different parts of the games industry. So chapter 1 is about Pillars of Eternity by Obsidian. Obsidian at first was funded by Microsoft back in 2011-2012 to make a game called Stormlands. Unfortunately, in March 2012, Urquhart, who is the director of Obsidian, got a call from a Stormlands producer at Microsoft stating that it was getting canceled. Unfortunately, expectation after expectation got piled onto Stormlands the game and turned it into this thing that everyone was scared of developing. It was just too unwieldy. And Obsidian, as a company, only had one other game in development, South Park: The Stick of Truth, which had its own trials and tribulations when it was going back and forth between publishers like THQ and so on. Obsidian crunched the numbers, and they just did not have the cash to keep all 50-ish of their employees employed, because the burn rate is estimated to be about $10,000 a month due to salary and benefits and so on. And to keep 50 people employed, it seemed impossible if they didn't have multiple games that they were working on. So unfortunately, they had to lay off 26 people who worked on Stormlands, including an engineer who was just hired the day before the layoffs occurred. After nearly 10 years, Obsidian Entertainment started to wonder if this was the end of them, because recently they also had a fallout with Fallout New Vegas. Their publisher, Bethesda, offered Obsidian a $1 million bonus if the game hit an 85 out of 100 on Metacritic. Unfortunately, the game settled at an 84, and Obsidian didn't get any cent of that bonus whatsoever. So independent studios like Obsidian have 3 ways to stay afloat. They find investors, they sign contracts with publishers to make the games that publishers want, or they fund their own video games through war chests that they've had from previous profits of other games. No decent-sized studio could really survive without relying partly on any other money from outside partners or publishers. But finally, in 2011-ish, a 4th option has finally revealed itself. Kickstarter, a crowdfunding website. I'm sure everyone has heard of Kickstarter or something similar. GoFundMe, Fig, all of these sort of crowdfunding websites. Big publishers at this time in 2012-ish were very conservative due to the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 ending their lifespan, and the new console generation of the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 coming out very soon. Also, publishers believed that console gaming was going to plummet due to the rise of mobile gaming, and publishers didn't want to invest tens of millions of dollars in big games without knowing if people would actually buy the next generation of the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. So a lot of game studios were in flux during this transition period to the next generation of console gaming. So Obsidian wanted to survive. They had to work really hard on figuring out what they were going to work on next. Thankfully, they did have quite a bit of money saved up, but it wasn't enough to have people work for a few more years on a brand new project. They decided to reinvent themselves by going back to their roots. A lot of Obsidian's DNA came from Black Isle and Interplay, and these studios were best known for developing and publishing old school isometric RPGs such as Baldur's Gate and Planetscape Torment. These were based on worlds that have rules within Dungeons & Dragons, and they have a huge focus on story and dialogue and the fixed angle isometric camera. Nobody was really making games like that anymore. They gone out of favor in the mid-2000s, and they were replaced with 3D graphics and voice acting and far fewer, deeper conversations. Publishers were trying to chase a mega hit like Elder Scrolls Skyrim that was released in November 2011. But Obsidian decided to work on something called Project Eternity, and it took a few months to fully pitch and flesh out. And they went to various publishers, and no one was really picking it up for the reasons that were stated earlier. Obsidian also at the same time was working on a Russian game called Armor Warfare in 2012 as a financial security blanket in case their passion project wasn't able to be built, so they would be able to squeeze out a few more years of life of their studio. But eventually, between the directors and owners of Obsidian, they went back and forth. Oh, we don't want to do Kickstarter because it makes us look desperate. It's this new thing. It doesn't really work. But then they saw other people get some success with it, and they realized that maybe this is something that we should push for. So they created a Kickstarter. And they published it. And within the first morning, they hit $700,000 raised. And after a full day, they hit their original goal of $1.1 million. They then started building stretch goals. And it was a tricky balancing act because you don't want to promise too much, but also at the same time, you want to get money in order to build this game. One of the things they promised was a second large hub city, which eventually they found that was not the best idea because it took a lot of effort to make. And finally, on October 16, 2012, it was the final day of their Kickstarter campaign. They had raised $3.98 million, which means, oh my God, we are still in business. We can still make this passion project. We can still feed and salary our employees. So this was a huge boon and really brought up the morale within Obsidian Entertainment. But it was a completely different beast because you used to be able to say, yeah, this game is going to take us 2.5 years to make. Okay, here's $5 million. And once you get to that 2.5 year mark, you go back to your publisher and say, you know what, I think we need another 6 months. Can we have another $1 million or $5 million or whatever it is? And it was easier to kind of finesse those conversations. That's just kind of how that worked in the industry. But now with Kickstarter, you have 30 days to raise the money. You make all these promises to your various backers at the various tiers that they've backed at, and then that's it. You can't really ask for any more money because there's no one to ask money for again. You can't really make another Kickstarter because then you look like an ass. You should have planned your crowdfunding a little bit better, sort of thing, is the general idea behind that. So, very exciting and new and tumultuous times. Publishers are kind of dumb. They're trying to protect their money. I understand. Hello, Drew. How you doing? Yes, Sparks, you're right. So, between the owners and the game directors, there were disagreements about how many maps the game should have at first. 120 was a number that was thrown out by game developers, but then 150 were decided on by the main director. And the number of maps makes a huge difference, obviously, because that means several extra months of work, which expands the schedule and costs a lot of money. And sure, you can have some maps that look very similar, but you can't have too much of a repetition or people are going to feel like they've been conned. Badash, thank you so much for the host. Welcome on in. Also, another obstacle that they faced was that artists and animators within Obsidian mostly used a program called Soft Image to create their 3D graphics, but by 2012 it felt really obsolete and it lacked a lot of pivotal and cutting edge features compared to the various competitors. And in actuality, in 2014, Soft Image was discontinued. So Obsidian made a great decision to decide to switch to Maya, which is a very popular, even to this day, 3D graphic creation tool. Unfortunately, you can be a very skilled artist, but if you change your tool, so if you're a painter and you work mostly in watercolors, and then someone says, hey, I want to commission you, you make a lot of great landscapes, but what I want you to do is do it in colored pencils. It's like, okay, I can do that because I do have a lot of experience as an artist, but it's a completely different tool, a completely different medium. It's going to take me some time to learn this tool, learn the right ways to blend, to crosshatch, to do shading, and then also make perspective look proper based off of these new tools. It's the exact same thing with 3D animation within computer graphics. So early production moved far more slowly in Obsidian Entertainment for this project, and they didn't really have an accurate schedule for early pre-production. So the directors couldn't determine how much money the project will fully cost and how much time it will take. So there was a lot of pressure on the artists at the beginning, especially, to learn this tool right away and to create assets. So the very first major goal that the team had was to hit a vertical slice. A vertical slice is known as a small chunk of the video game designed to resemble the final product in as many ways as possible. So graphics, gameplay, physics, overall combat, or interactions that the player will do. And it's just, a few minutes, a part of a level, something that's like, if you play this, therefore you will see that the rest of the game will be very similar. So it's sort of like a demo, but a little bit more basic, a little bit more like a step before a vertical slice is a step before you put out a demo, and very, very far before like a beta or even an alpha. That's true. Okay. Yeah, tools are renamed different things and all that sort of stuff. I definitely agree, Drew. I know. I wish I could see vertical slices for all sorts of various games. I've seen one for XCOM, but I want it for every game. So, vertical slices resemble the final product in as many ways as possible, and Kickstarter approaches criticism in real time, and it helps make the game better in a way that on previous projects it wasn't really possible, because usually you would present to a developer maybe once a quarter or a little bit more often, and you just do a small little vertical slice or a in-game cutscene just to let them know like things were going on, and they're like, okay, yeah, that's fine. But Kickstarter backers are people like you and me. We kind of want to see a little bit more because we are directly investing. We want you to make this game. I've given you $60 of my pledge because I want it to have multiplayer co-op capabilities. Okay, it's been 2 years since I've pledged. Give me something. Let me know something has occurred. For instance, one of the things within Project Eternity was that item durability was seen as tedious and boring by a lot of the Kickstarter backers, so it was scrapped. So in 2013, Obsidian decided to hire a published novelist, Carrie Patel, and she stated, narrating late to the party was a challenge in the way that a story was assembled. There were a bunch of different treatments put together by different people in pre-production, and the result was taking some of the best of all of those and assembling it into a story. They compare writing a video game to look at a story less like a road, but more like trees, where different players move around different branches. And sometimes those branches cross, and other times they will never touch each other. Which is very interesting. Once again, it shows how video games are so completely different from all sorts of different types of entertainment media. Yeah, Sparks, but I want it for every game. No, I agree. Later on in the book, they definitely talk about how vertical slices and demos are basically what they show at E3 or PSX or Gamescom. Because it makes sense that you create a vertical slice or a demo and not necessarily to show off an engine unless that's your goal, but more of, okay, we got this level like half done. You can see the first half of it so you can get a feel and a taste of the combat and how the characters interact with each other and what our dialogue is going to be like and so on. Hello, Vamp. Welcome. How are you? Ooh, did you recently just change your name? Nice. Okay. So, exhilarated by positive reactions of the in-game trailer at the end of 2013, the project had momentum. But the workload was still intimidating, and the schedule had a track of a November 2014 release. But there was still a great deal of the game left to be finished. So usually, when games feel like their schedule is too tight, producers cut features or areas that don't seem critical. But with Pillars of Eternity, Obsidian promised these features to fans and backers in the Kickstarters. So it was nearly impossible to cut certain things. For instance, the developers showed a huge 15-level optional dungeon that they had to construct, no matter how many late nights it took. They also promised a second city, which Urquhart said ultimately was not a necessary feature. But if they didn't deliver it, every future promise in the Kickstarter, fans would feel betrayed and not trust Obsidian as a developer anymore. Obsidian struck a deal with Paradox to help out with PR, and a part of that deal was Obsidian had to go to E3, which would be huge. They would have a presence at the gaming Mecca. It's a huge industry event. Even to this day, maybe people are kind of coming away from it a little bit and more releasing on their social media or on YouTube or doing a first look peek on Twitch. But E3 is important from the business and investor side of things as well too. So it's still going to be around. Maybe might evolve to show up in other countries, at other conventions. E3 isn't the only game in town anymore, sort of ideas what's going on in the gaming industry right now. Especially since they've opened up E3 to the general public. It's not just a business convention anymore. So there's a few gaming developers, studios, publishers that are a little disillusioned with like, okay, of course we love our consumers, we love our public, they buy our games, they care about our art just as much as we do. Sometimes a little bit too much. But we don't really have a playable demo. We have more of like a vertical slice or an in-game trailer. And if we don't have a kick-ass demo for people to play, then we're going to get negative press, and that's not really great. We don't need that. We're still a year out from our initial release dates. Let's not involve ourselves in something that tragic yet, is the general consensus of what I've experienced and seen when I worked in the game industry as well too. So the Obsidian team had a few weeks to work on a demo that was functional and polished enough to pass for a final game. They made the decision to do a vertical slice that comprised of something that was going to ship in the game already, so the work is not wasted. Thankfully, after E3, they had great press coverage, and many reporters were immediately sold on Pillar of Eternity's potential. After E3, they had to go work on a backer beta, because they also wanted to make a demo playable to the public at Gamescom, which meant that they had a hard deadline of August 18th, 2014. They did it. They crunched it. That goal had passed. They crunched it. That goal passed. There we go. Unfortunately, by September of 2014, it dawned on most of the Obsidian team that shipping would be difficult to do in November. The game wasn't polished enough yet, so they pushed to a March 2015 release. So something that does come up a lot in this book is that one common theme in video game development is that everything comes together at the last moment during a final stretch where the team is crunching nonstop to get the game out of the door. It's impossible to find every bug, and they do the best that they can. Thankfully, Obsidian didn't have to worry about consoles because it was solely a computer game, but one of the issues was that the game was running out of memory, and they had to figure out how to get it stable and running on most machines. But finally, on March 26, 2015, Obsidian released Pillars of Eternity. And critics loved it. Obsidian sold over 700,000 copies in the first year, exceeded their expectations, and ensured that they would be able to do a sequel. In the following months, the team would keep patching bug fixes, and they were incredibly stoked that they came and they emerged out of the ashes from the Stormlands cancellation. Yeah, Los Angeles is very expensive. I've been to E3. It was crazy. In the entire tech industry. I mean, in every industry, there can be crunch. I think it's more pervasive in the video game industry more so than others, though. I know Jeff crunches. Jeff is at work right now. It's a crunch. He's spending a full weekend day working on a project for work. But he loves his job, and he's an artist. And he's incredibly proud and hardworking and tenacious and determined. And kind of a workaholic. He puts a lot of his stock of his identity in his job, in his what he creates. And that works for him. I'm somewhat similar, but not as passionate. How's everyone feeling so far? Anything that you want to comment on or speak about? Wow, that was a cool cloud. All right. Pillars of Eternity also in 2015 won a bunch of different awards for Best RPG and so on. So it helped secure Obsidian's future as an independent studio, and they're still going pretty strong to this day. And also, just to clarify, Paradox was like a publisher, but they only helped with marketing, localization, and distribution, and they don't own any rights to Pillars of Eternity. So it's a success story. Nearly 3 years ago, since their release of Pillars of Eternity, they had to lay off over a dozen employees, and now they could celebrate the gamble paid off using Kickstarter backers. And Pillar of Eternity developers really enjoyed interacting with fans and getting instant feedback from their work. And about 6 months later, on January 26, 2017, Obsidian launched Pillars of Eternity 2 on Fig, which is another crowdfunding program website that was created by Obsidian, with a goal of $1.1 million, and they were funded in 22 hours, and at the end of the campaign, they raised $4.4 million. Of course, not all money issues are completely solved, but for Urquhart and his team of developers at Obsidian, they figured out how to finance their own video game, and money and budget is no longer as huge of an issue as it was back in 2014. So, yay, success story, they did great! But unfortunately, for every single success story, it doesn't always work out. And especially, obviously, this book was published a year or so ago, maybe even 2 years now. So some of these things aren't necessarily true anymore. Obsidian recently was purchased by Microsoft Studios, but they still have the same CEO, Urquhart, that we were talking about, and they have nearly tripled the amount of employees that they have because they do have a parent organization. So just because a studio or a company or an LLC has a parent organization, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've lost their independence. It just means that they have more financial security and backing, as well as a bigger network of fellow mid-sized, like-minded companies to work in, because they're within a family of companies due to the parent company acquiring them or buying a bunch of stock within them. And of course, that does mean that the parent organization does have influence on the projects and the thoughts and the direction overall of the company that they bought, but not really in the day-to-day or necessarily in every single project. Just more of like, in 2019 we'd really like you to make a mobile game, and it's like, well, really, do we have to? Can we do it in 2020? And it's like, okay, that kind of thing. So what are you referring to, Drew? Because this book does talk about Bungie. Yeah, Destiny 1 and Halo Wars. In indirect ways, so about Microsoft Studios and Bungie. It's a great book. So, the second studio that I want to speak about is one that I really enjoy as well too. I like Obsidian a lot because they did Knights of the Republic 2. which is one of my favorite games. Fallout New Vegas is also really great. I played a little bit of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 off stream. Later this weekend, we're going to be playing Star Wars Knights of the Republic 1 and Knights of the Republic 2 later on in the month. So I'm pretty excited about that. Hopefully you are too. Just FYI. Okay. So we are going to speak about Naughty Dog. I obviously really enjoy Naughty Dog. They've done amazing games. Crash Bandicoot is my favorite platformer, and I really don't like platformers. I like Crash Bandicoot a lot. They also did Jak and Daxter, and more recently you would know the Uncharted series and Last of Us. I did. Let me bring up exactly the wording of what I did. I also worked on... I don't think this is... No, that's Insomniac. That's right. Okay. I was the sole and only influencer relations manager for North, Central, and South American gaming content creators for Uncharted 4. So, in layman's terms, I made sure that all the big players that Naughty Dog and Sony and PlayStation wanted to play Uncharted 4 were given all the proper information, assets, game codes, and direct lines of communication in order to facilitate a wonderful first 72-hour launch of Uncharted 4. Long business card. No. My title was just influencer manager. I enjoyed doing it, but it was too crunchy, and I got way too stressed and anxious about work, so I went back to IT. Also, IT pays better, and people don't look at you as if they can do your job very easily. Good to have it on resume. I mean, I guess, but I don't think I'll ever go back to games industry. It was a really interesting part of my life, and I'm really glad that I had that experience. But it just wasn't for me because it was too stressful and too anxiety inducing, and I wasn't in a great place personally to be able to deal with something like that, so I understood why I had to leave and move back into an industry that I felt very comfortable with, and I'm also very good at. Not that I wasn't good at the marketing stuff, it's just it was too stressful where I would attempt to get people to play these games, but we weren't paying them, and it was looked upon as if it was my fault or the firm's fault that no one wanted to play a specific type of game, or they didn't play it in time, or they didn't do a glowing positive 100% 10 out of 10 review. And I get it, it sucks, but I just was not into having that type of stress in my life. So with IT, of course, things are blamed on me too, but I don't mind it. because it's a different feeling. So like if an event doesn't go perfectly because tech was messed up, I can own that a lot better because I had a lot of influence. But anyway. One of the things that were talked about early in the Naughty Dog chapter was employees work and most hours staying in the office late as 2 or 3 a.m. They were exploring something universal when they were making Uncharted 4. How do you follow your dreams without destroying your relationships? Sometimes your life's passion isn't in line with your life's love, and those things are in conflict in games. Especially a lot of people enter the games industry but because of how much they love the medium, how much they love video games. But the ones who succeed are the ones who can push and dedicate their lives to a larger degree to actually publishing and creating these games. And if you're not careful, it can destroy your personal life. So there's a lot of personal experience for the game developers to draw from when they were making Uncharted 4. So if you don't know the basics of Uncharted 4, the story is that it's the 4th game that Nathan Drake is in. It's his very last game that he is going to be involved in. Doesn't necessarily mean that Uncharted as a series is over, but Drake, Nathan, he retired from the tomb raiding and the artifact plundering that he did. He got married to Elena, who is his one of his partners in crimes throughout the series as well too. And you see that Nathan is basically really bored being just a normal person living life, and he gets tempted into his plundering ways again, and how to navigate him wanting to be passionate and really enjoying that part of his life, but then also lying to Elena about what he was doing and how he almost destroyed his marriage going through that. So your life's love and your life's passion. He's passionate about the plundering, but he loves Elena, so how to balance keeping both of those happy. And in the end, they basically reconcile, everything's good, and they're going to still do artifact searching, but do it in a legal way with this shipping company that Elena buys, is the gist of it. Sorry if you haven't played Uncharted. I've played on and off half of the games altogether. It's enjoyable. It's a really great ride, and there's a bunch of little things that I obviously didn't tell you about, little Easter eggs or other side characters. I mean, I cried at certain points because it was so damn good. And it is a series that I do want to play through again, but time is money, friends. Spoilers. Yeah, I mean, it is, but like, it's the same as, I don't know. I don't think it's that big of a deal to know that, yeah, everything is fine at the end. Okay, great. Usually, the majority of stories that you read or watch or play is that the hero wins at the end. Great. But what about all the trials and tribulations that take the effort of them getting to that point? How many other relationships did they destroy? How many other people died along the way? What has the main character lost and gained until they got to the point where, like, everything is fine? I totally agree that the journey is more important than the ending. I don't really care if someone tells me that so-and-so dies at the end of this game, or so-and-so kills them. And it's like, okay, that kind of sucks. I kind of wish that I didn't know that, but it's not going to really ruin my ability to finish the book or the movie or the series. It's actually going to help my anxiety and stress about thinking about these characters, because I know that everything is going to be okay or everything goes to shit, and we try to see why and how to fix that as we go on. The game journey. I haven't played that yet. It is on the list. The never-ending list. So, Naughty Dog was founded in 1984 by Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin. They spent 2 decades with platformers such as Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, and were iconic franchises on the PlayStation. In 2001, Sony bought Naughty Dog under the veteran director Amy Heinig. Naughty Dog started the Uncharted projects. PlayStation 3 cell processors were famously difficult for engineers to work with. Uncharted 1 came out in 2007. Uncharted 2 shipped in 2009. Naughty Dog moved to Uncharted 3. And game developer Druckmann worked on The Last of Us, which was inspired by Cormac McCarthy's The Road book. They wanted the characters to leave some thoughts unsaid. Such as, they didn't really want Joel to straight up say, "Hey, Ellie, you're filling the emotional void left by my dead daughter." They wanted it to be hinted at through the story, and I think they did such a brilliant job. Oh, God. Last of Us is so good, and I can't wait for the second one. Anyway. But I will wait, because crunch is bad. In June 2013, fans and critics were raving about The Last of Us, and it was the most successful game in Naughty Dog's history. During those same years of development, Amy Heinig was working on Uncharted 4, and she had a very small skeleton staff because so many of the developers and engineers were lifted to work on Last of Us, and then also, at the beginning of 2014, the Left Behind DLC expansion. The studio went to an emergency mode. They wanted to diagnose problems with Uncharted 4, and there are 2 different conflicting perspectives. One was saying that there just isn't enough staff and resources, and others said Amy had trouble making decisions. And so in March of 2014, Amy exited and didn't come back to Naughty Dog. And she also signed an NDA saying that she would not say anything negative about the studio as long as they didn't say anything negative about her. And she did not... she declined to be interviewed for this book. And within a few months of her also leaving the studio, her creative partner Justin Richmond left, and so did other veteran developers and engineers who worked closely with her. So that's a whole nother story, and there's actually quite a few interviews and podcasts that she's been a part of over the years where she's hinted at and talked about not only Uncharted 4, but also Star Wars 1313, or 1313. I'm not sure exactly what the proper terminology is for it because it's a cancel game, so... An NDA? Yes. Non-disclosure agreement or non-disparagement clause. After termination. It happens a lot in a lot of tech industries and a lot of companies. So, the directors of Last of Us went into Uncharted 4. They knew it needed help. It was in a bad state in regards to the lines of communication, and the pipeline was in a great position to be in, but they believed in the Naughty Dog name and in the team. They realized that they weren't interested in finishing Amy's story, and they scrapped a great deal of cutscenes and voice work and animations. They recasted major roles in Uncharted 4. They decided it would be the last one starring Nathan Drake. And Druckmann wanted to maintain as much of the previous work as possible, but sometimes they had to cut things that someone spent months working on. And that's a very hard decision to make, but it was necessary overall. Because sometimes you don't have a proper time to consider choices, but you have to make them. And he said, maybe you'll get it about 80% right, but it's better than taking too much time and energy to get it 100% right. And leaving people in lurch and like wondering, okay, what do I develop on today? Well, nope, I have to wait for my director to decide what I'm gonna work on. Okay, I'm just gonna sit here, that kind of thing. So, in June 2014, Naughty Dog went to E3 and in 2014, in June, Naughty Dog went to E3 and had a teaser trailer for Uncharted 4, and it basically hinted that Nathan Drake was going to die. They did it because they wanted a bunch of hype behind it. They wanted people to think that the studio was going to kill off Nathan Drake, even though they definitely weren't going to. For instance, one of the things that they had to scrape after E3 was that there were a few dancing cutscenes and mini gameplay interactions, and it seemed fun, but it didn't really fit into the game as a whole. There was a ballroom dance and a dance scene with dinner at home between Nathan and Elena. But it didn't really get the feeling that they wanted. It wasn't fun to play, so they had to figure out something else. And someone suggested, well, why don't they play a video game at home? And there was this iconic Easter egg where they would play Crash Bandicoot against each other. And that was a huge draw and a huge hype success. So in the end, PlayStation PSX, sorry, in 2014 drew closer, and Straley and Druckmann realized that they weren't ever going to leave Uncharted 4. They were going to have to see it to the end. They thought that they were just going to steer the ship and not pilot it, but they were getting incredibly burnt out. They just worked on 2 huge games in a row. Last of Us and now Uncharted 4. And it was clear that after PSX that Uncharted 4 was not going to be able to come out in 2015, and they agreed to a new shipping date of March 2016. And in the weeks leading up to E3 2015, they wanted to showcase an epic chase in the demo where you try to balance people getting excited and making sure that you're selling the game that is actually being shown. And unfortunately, they realized that the vertical slice, the demo that they did show, was one of the most epic and interesting parts of the game as a whole. And sometimes those decisions are made and not necessarily something that they really wanted to do, but it was one of the most developed parts of the game, and it's what they were able to show during that crunch. So, Naughty Dog's co-president, Evan Wells, said that, unfortunately, crunch is something that occurs in every single game development, and it's something that's never mandated from the top down. They never change their 40-hour expectation per week or the core hours of 10:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., but people put in a lot more hours based on their own feelings and how much they have in their tank. But this is also a cascading effect, because one designer could be staying late to finish up a level, and then others in that team feel pressure to stay late. And then once that side of the project is finished, then other people who are in other departments feel pressure to stay late as well too, where it's like, okay, well, you only have an hour before you can finish that. Well, if I just stay, I could get a head start and work on doing the proper animations or physics, and then I'll go home around like 1 a.m. or something. Okay, cool, I'll do that. And people see these daunting deadlines of a demo or a vertical slice or a final finished product, and people who are passionate about their art and their creations want to put the very best of themselves into it, which means that they stay late and they come in on weekends. And unfortunately, a lot of times they start getting really focused in on polishing something like a level or a animation that's already at 95% perfection. But there's something over here that needs to be done that's only at 60% completion. And a lot of the time, crunch is hard and occurs because developers or producers have trouble seeing the forest, the whole entire picture, for the trees. So you're focusing so much on this minute detail, and it's important. But what's most important is to make sure that you get the product out and in a stable condition. So that's something that contributes a lot to stress and crunch within the games industry. So in the last months of production, a favorite set piece was a sequence in Scotland climbing up a crane, and it fell apart and you have to escape. Unfortunately, that got scrapped on out because they just could not get it perfected and they really just needed to get the game out. And so they had to get rid of a level that they put so many months of effort into because it just was not at a good enough state for the final release. A lot of Naughty Dog's team also says that game testers are so incredibly important because after you work 2+ years on a game, you lose so much objectivity, and clarity is lost for a while, and you realize with game developers who come in with a fresh mind are able to let you know, oh, I'm confused by the story, or they're not picking up certain nuances of how to interact with objects. And it's a very humbling thing because everything is put into a perspective, and there's always a sinking feeling in your stomach because you don't know how it's going to pan out. And it's helpful, but it also makes you realize that, okay, our release date is March 25th, and we have 3 months left, and one of our main components of combat doesn't make sense to any of our focus group, or a huge part of how we get our story is our characters walking to their vehicle or something. But every single focus tester looks so bored during this sequence and just runs around circles around the NPC and isn't really paying attention to the story. So how to fix those things is really helpful when they use focus testing groups. And finally, increasingly, the practice of releasing a day one patch to fix bugs that make it into gold masters is increasing, because physical copies have to be put on a disc and then put inside of their game sleeves and then shipped out to distributors. That takes a few weeks to get that all sorted. But that also means that the game that you put on those CDs, on those DVDs, is the game from 4 weeks ago. So thankfully, due to the internet, it means that we're able to get game patches in as long as people are able to connect their consoles or their PCs in. But if someone never connects their console or their PC that they game on to the internet in order to get those patches, they are being shipped and buying an inferior product in the end. Some people are okay with that. Obviously, you could see the issue with that when you realize that, okay, well, our ship date is May 1st, but not a big deal because we could just do a day one patch. So, okay, we put the games on these DVDs, 4 more weeks of crunch, go, 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 for this day one patch that will release on the internet, sort of thing. But thankfully, on December 2015, Sean Lead was the president of Sony Computer Entertainment America and gave Naughty Dog a shipment date in April instead of earlier in 2016, and they were able to push it a little bit further. And on May 10th, 2016, Uncharted 4 sold 2.7 million copies in their first week and received stellar reviews. Straley, one of the top game directors for Uncharted 4 and Last of Us 1, stated that he was not going to return to co-direct Last of Us Part 2, and he's taking a very, very long sabbatical from video game development, which makes sense because he was burnt out for nearly 5 years straight. He was crunching constantly. So overall, like we were stating at the very beginning of the chat here, every single video game is made in abnormal circumstances. It is a miracle that any game really gets published and becomes a success, because so many different games are being made, so many different obstacles occur every single day for game developers, from one person to mid-sized studios to AAA publishers and developers. This is a really interesting book because there's so many different wonderful games in here. There are indie games in here. There are sequels to huge intellectual properties and everything in between. There are canceled games in here. And one of the questions at the very end, is there a way to make great video games without sacrifice? Is it possible to develop a game without putting in endless hours? Will there ever be a reliable formula for making games that allows for more predictable schedules? For many industry observers, the answers to those questions are no, probably not. Game development is, as BioWare's Matt Goldman describes it, like being on the knife's edge of chaos, where the sheer number of moving parts make it impossible for anyone to find predictability. But isn't that one of the reasons why we love video games in the first place? The feeling of surprise when you pick up a controller and know you're about to experience something totally new. Obsidian's audio director Justin Bell says, making a game attracts a certain type of workaholic personality. It requires a certain type of person who's willing to put in more time. Crunch sucks. It fucks up your life. You emerge from crunch and think, I've got kids. I'll see my kids. I'll look at them and I think, wow, 6 months have passed. You're a different person now. And I wasn't there. So, I really enjoyed this book. I'm excited to reread through it. A lot of different games that you can look into as well too. I recommend picking it up yourself, enjoying it, comparing it to the fiasco that occurred with Telltale as well too. And hopefully it makes you appreciate the video games that you consume, the media in general that you consume, and how much time and love and effort and sacrifice these artists and engineers and developers and producers put into it. Yeah, I've wanted to make a game before too. And I've worked on doing mods and all this sort of thing for various games that I've grown up with. But I don't think I'll ever publish any of those things because I'm not really into the whole idea of it being so heavily scrutinized. Streaming is enough for me. Me taking other people's content and overlaying my education and my internal ideologies and philosophies on top of it is perfectly enough public creativity scrutiny for me. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed our second book club. Our next book is going to be psychological, hardcore self-help, Fuck Anxiety by Robert Duff, PhD. Mental Health for Real People. So it's a pretty quick read. There's also a 10-week intensive online course and a private hardcore Facebook self-help group. This was originally released in 2014, and this is the third edition, the 2018 recently released. This book isn't for everyone, but it gives you some good ideas on how to fuck anxiety, which is so damn helpful for me. Hopefully it will be for you. We will be talking about this very, very soon. So, thanks everyone. I'm glad that you really enjoyed this. I did too. I like talking about intellectual things, and of course sometimes games get us to that point, but it's really enjoyable to focus in on a certain topic that really means a lot to me and also the community. So I'm going to take a quick break right now, and then we are going to play some games. So stick around, do some roulettes, do some gambling. I'm going to get some more water, I'm going to stretch, and we will be right back. Thanks!